Graham Power, who has come to us all the way from Cape Town, South Africa. So adding to the entirely international dimension of what we're doing. So we're really pleased to have him here. The title of his presentation is Unashamedly Ethical, an entrepreneurial quest to change a culture of corruption. One thing we're doing with this conference this year in particular is to focus on entrepreneurial difference making. So not just using entrepreneurial skills for profit motives, but rather how can we use those entrepreneurial skills to have an impact in our industry, in our community, possibly our country, and even beyond our country. So Graham has an incredible story that he'll share with us. He's chairman of Power Group. He started the company in 1983 with its core purpose to improve the quality of life in Africa through infrastructure development. The Power Group operates nationally from 4 regional offices in South Africa: Cape Town, Port Elizabeth, Centurion, and Kinsna. The civil engineering arms include Power Construction South, operating the Western, Southern, and Eastern Cape, and Power Construction North, operating in Gauteng. Power Building is based in Cape Town, but operates nationally. Power Developments is the property development division of the group, based in Cape Town, and operates nationally from the regional offices. Now, I'll just mention, to wrap up his introduction, Graham has been involved in starting an organization called Unashamedly Ethical, which deals with anti-corruption practices. And it's quite interesting because Bob talked about doing business internationally, and one issue that often comes up is the nature of corruption. That's something that Graham is committed to doing something about. Secondly, Graham is the person who initiated the Global Day of Prayer. And he'll talk about how he had the vision for this Global Day of Prayer starting in South Africa. And from there, it's rippled out to, I think it's over 100 countries around the world. So it's a phenomenal movement, all started in South Africa. So if you can welcome Graham Power.
I grew up with a father who came out of the Second World War as a motor mechanic, was the only job that was available. And my mother ended up going to work each day on a bicycle in the rain and in the elements. And in order to provide us 5 children, that we each could have one pair of shoes. And eventually, when I managed to get a bicycle, it was one that had been handed down in the family and had many coats of paint on it. And we grew up with very little, and probably because I had so little in life, or what I at that stage thought was very little, my whole focus and goal was to want to achieve and to climb the ladder. My eldest brother and sister, I was number 4 out of 5, ended up leaving school at the age of 15, so that us younger 3 were able to finish our high schooling. My father passed away when I was 18, when I was doing my final year at schooling. There was never going to be money to go to university or college, so I immediately started working for a construction company as a trainee surveyor. So I did survey, quantity surveying, project management, etc. And worked hard, probably put in a 12 to 14 hour day, 6 days a week, and did many things that I'm not particularly proud of. I would, in order to climb that ladder, I would tramp on people, I would do many, many things in order to really just get ahead. And got to the point where at the age of 28, 9.5 years after I'd started after I'd started working for this company, I ended up starting my own business. And at the time I was running a fairly large division of this company. I was due to be the youngest director of that company that year, but through the prompting of my wife and a few friends, I took the bold step of starting on my own, bought a second-hand pickup, and started doing parking areas and driveways and things like that. And progressively we were able to grow the business. And today we employ about 2,000 employees, and we operate across the whole of South Africa, and have been into places like Uganda, which we've become quite friendly with the First Lady, and have helped them with some machinery and farming equipment, etc. So I ended up in that first 15 to 17 years of my life within own business of chasing success. More companies, more turnover, more material things. And each time you get to the next goal that you'd set, there still would not be this inner peace. And I got to the stage where I was 42 years old. It was towards the end of 1998. And unbeknown to me, within the company, there was my secretary, who was a dedicated Christian, and she had rounded up 4 or 5 other people within the company that did a few crazy things. When I was out on the projects, running the sites and helping, managing the projects, they would come into my office and they would pray for me. In fact, they did some weird and wonderful things like anoint my desk and anoint my door. And eventually I discovered these things. And I said to them, "Man, are you crazy?" At the time, if I knew it, I probably would have fired you. And it was through their intervention, I believe, that God turned my life around. So there was an organization called Nation Build, and in the construction and the building industry, every 2 or 3 months they would have a gathering, a breakfast or a lunch, and they would get a speaker, and then they'd invite all the engineers and the architects and the town planners and the quantity surveyors, people in our line of business. And they kept inviting me to attend these things for probably 3-4 years. And I kept saying, "Well, I'm too busy, but next time, next time." And this particular time, towards the end of 1998, they said to me, "Well, they're going to have 300 people. It's going to include all of the top politicians and all the top councillors, people that are important for us for the awarding of tenders." And I said, "Well, this is an opportunity. It's a networking opportunity. I've got to go." Well, that day I want to say to you that I think God really led me into that. And a dear friend who today is one of my spiritual mentors, Michael Cassidy, was the speaker, an organization called African Enterprise. And I was challenged that day. I was 42 at the time, and the same organization 3 months later had another such a gathering. And this time, one of our sporting heroes, Peter Pollock, many of you would know baseball far better than you would know cricket, but it's that boring game that they play for 5 days and sometimes don't have a result at the end of 5 days. Anyway, that's the cricketing game, and Peter was one of the captains of our national team. And that day as a speaker, and he's got a real sly way about it. At the end of his talk, he would tell you the story about his wife, who was a real nag bag, and if he got home after 9 o'clock at night and he'd had 5 beers with the boys after a game, then she would give him the cold shoulder and he wouldn't get a warm plate of food, and she'd probably be in her room. And he tells about how her life had turned upside down and how he ended up a year later committing his life. And then he asks you to, he says, "Well, now I'm going to ask you to, I would like to pray with you. Close your eyes." And then he prays and he says, "Keep your eyes closed. Now you pray this prayer with me." And he says, "Lord Jesus, I ask that you'll come into my life, forgive my sin and heal me," etc., etc. He said, "Keep your eyes closed. If you said that prayer for the first time, will you raise your hand?" I raised my hand. Well, somebody must have had their eyes open, because they phoned me the next day. And I want to tell you that from that point onwards, my life has been turned upside down. Within the company, within our industry, there was a lot of collusion, a lot of price fixing, a lot of networking with the competitors. So when government puts out, or the local authority puts out a particular tender, the dozen or so companies would in fact liaise with one another. We got so bold that not only did we liaise with one another and say, "Are you putting in a tender?" or, "I'll stand back and you go for this particular one." We got so bold that even the day before the formal closure of these tenders, we at times would meet and we would have a pre-opening. And then we would say, "Okay, this value is 100 million, so we can add on 5%, and then we can split the 5% amongst us." And this is the kind of things that were taking place in our industry. So in 1999, having made a commitment, having read some of the scriptures like Proverbs 11 verse 1, which says, "The Lord abhors dishonest scales, but accurate weights are his delight," I ended up having the difficult choice of having to speak to these more than a dozen key competitors and to say to them, "Sorry friends, we're out of here. We're no longer part of this club." There were many things like, are you now a holy Joe? And of course they try to speak us out of the project. So if you had a client, private client, that would invite half a dozen companies to tender for their work, they would try and influence the client to say, don't invite Power, either they're too busy or this or that. So there were many, many things that were done by our competitors to try and talk us out, because the minute we were involved, there was no longer a price fixing or a collusion. So it was a tough time, it was a lonely time. And it was a situation that one ended up finding that because of what you stood for, there were some clients that would in fact award you projects without going to tender, because you were no longer going to put in claims, and the word got out, of the values and the ethics that you stood for. It was a serious shift within the company to get to my senior leadership and say to them, guys, I no longer want us to do these things. And the question was, can we survive? Will we survive? Got to a point where I said to the directors and our senior management, if we do not shift, then I'm going to have to consider exiting the business. I owned 80% of the stock at the time. And lo and behold, whether it was knowing that I had the majority stock, but the company and all of the leadership agreed. And I want to say to you that it was a very interesting and a very tough time. And yet through that period, we continued to grow. And where we went through many ups and downs in the economy, that was the time when, of course, Nelson Mandela was just released. We had all kinds of restrictions around the country, and through that we managed to grow and survive. So now, 1999, the commitment, middle of 2000, I head off to Spain, where I have a small holiday home, one of those which I bought with illegal money that you were not allowed to take out the country at the time. And I spent the month of July on holiday there with my family. And now people have heard that you've committed your life. It was public, and so everybody's giving you these books to read. I probably took along 24 books that holiday. I probably read 4, but I had a lot of quiet time. And the most dramatic experience in my life was in that end of July, 3 days before heading back home. I woke up the morning with the clearest, I say it wasn't a vision, it wasn't a dream, it was so clear it was an instruction. Higher Newlands, which is the largest stadium in our city, which seats 48,000 people, challenged the Christians from all the different denominations to come together for a day of repentance and prayer. The detail, the armband that I wear, the little goodie bag that people would get when they walked in through the gate, the color of the bag, what was inside the bag, absolute detail. And then in the dream it would start in Cape Town, it would roll out to South Africa, and from there it sort of faded into Africa or across Africa. I got back, I happened to serve on the board of directors of this stadium, and had been on the board for probably 12 years by then, and spoke to the managing director and said, I'd like to hire the stadium. He said, man, you're crazy. The only thing that had ever been played or done at that stadium was rugby. Not even soccer, football had ever been played there. And lo and behold, our chairman of the board is a Jewish gentleman, our vice president of the union is a Muslim gentleman, and they agreed. I want to say to you that at the time, in Cape Town, we had 22 bombs that had exploded in 18 months. 1999 and the year 2000. So with South Africa now being open, it was all about a sort of a mafia controlling drugs and cartels and things like that, a tough time. So that was, of course, one of our key focus areas. And lo and behold, the board accepted that we could have this day. And I'm going to give you the short version, but going along and speaking to the ministers, fraternals, and telling them that this is the dream, and guys would say, but now we know you're a business guy, but it's crazy. We can't go to Newlands. The biggest gathering we've had in our city was 5,000 people. We'll first go for a 10,000 seater, then a 20, and then over 3 or 4 years we'll work our way up to this 50,000 seater. But the vision was clear, and someone ended up going over these boulders, under these boulders, these obstructions, these questions. And lo and behold, 6 months later, we had the gathering. And I think you saw just some of the footage from that first gathering. And the request for tickets had grown to 80,000. So we ended up having to also send the signal out to some of the larger churches in the area. An exciting time, a challenging time. And amongst all of this was now trying to clean up your act. And it probably took me 2 years to pay taxes, stop putting through things through the business which I knew was not right. Many, many challenges. And lo and behold, we had that first day of prayer. It was awesome. It ended up being on in our 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock news the evening on national television across the country. The next day, the secular radio station was phoning in and saying, so what was this prayer gathering about, and who was there, what did you pray for? So it took off, beyond what a person could possibly imagine. And we were about to have the second day of prayer, 2002. And I ended up going to a men's gathering on a Friday morning at Stellenbosch, which is our wine growing district. And there was a young guy of color, a black guy. He had a few tattoos on his arm, 28 years old, and the topic was Holy Spirit. Well, as a very conservative Methodist boy, I had a situation where I had that morning, Friday morning, I had to go out onto the Christian radio and do a 10-minute talk about the day of prayer. When I got back, 8 of these 15 guys were lying on the floor, and this guy was praying for them, and I wasn't sure, do I just exit quickly, or do I enter there? And as he came around, this guy came, and as he put his hand on my shoulder, I want to tell you, for the first time in my life, I was flat on my back. And I had an electricity going through my body like I've never experienced in my life. I jumped up after about 5 minutes, not quite knowing what's going on, but I just had this heavy electricity. And he said, the Lord's not finished with you, down again, up again. Third time I was down for an hour and a half. And in that time, God took me through a phase. I was on a carpet similar to this, on my back. And Africa formed around this cross, with my feet in Cape Town, my head in Egypt, West Africa, East Africa. And I went through a phase where, as if I had headphones on with the volume turned right up, I had this booming voice. I'm the spine, the backbone. I'm the spine, I'm the spine. I'm the head of the spine, I'm the head of the spine. I'm the king of kings. And the next thing, I have pins and needles starting from my toes, rolling up till under my armpits. Whew. And that feels like 2 or 3 minutes past. The next thing, it starts from my arm, from my fingers to the top of my head, with this Africa formed around. And I clearly understand how Africa, through a spiritual revival starting from the southern tip through to the north, west to east, how Africa would become a light to the world. This dark continent, as crazy as it sounds, that Africa would become a light to the world. And not in 500 years' time or in 1,000 years' time. I'm talking about in your and my lifetime. And I want to say to you that as I'm lying there with this electricity going through my body, the next thing, I have an out-of-body experience where these 2 arms come alive, and it stretches out and out and out around the whole of the globe, and God pulls the whole of the globe into his chest as a mother would caress a newborn baby. And I got up there after that hour and a half, understanding how this thing would roll out, and that the next step would be, now we were down in Cape Town, the thickness of, call it the sole of my shoe. We were having this one gathering, or we had the one gathering the year before. We were about to have, in the 9 provinces in South Africa, a gathering, call it the height of my, up to my ankle, the height of my shoe. And that the next step would be all the way, all 27 nations, Southern Africa. The next year would be all 56 nations. So by 2004, every one of those nations, up to the top of Africa, were on board, same day, praying for Africa. The following year, 155 nations in the world. And by 2010, as was clearly shown through that stretching out and out, all 220 nations in the world, Rick, were on board. And the report back that we've got is that approximately 400 million people participated worldwide. This is not man's plan. I cannot claim any credit. This is God's plan. Now I want to fast forward and take you to what I briefly tried to explain there about the 6th of October 2006. Second time in my life. We had a 2-day conference similar to this. We had Ed Silvoso as our speaker. I got to bed that evening at about 12 o'clock, and the next morning at 4 o'clock, for the second time in my life, I wake up with an electricity through my body. And from 4 o'clock until 7:30 that morning, I went through the shaking. I was sopping wet. My wife thought I'm having a heart attack, put a hand on my chest. I explained to her, I'm okay, I'll explain to her later. And for 3.5 hours, I had a download, second time in my life, where I understood that there would be 3 waves that would cross over Africa and the globe. The first wave was this wave of prayer, that at that stage was rolling, and it was across 2/3 of the world at that point, 2006. That the next phase would be a phase of ethics, values, and clean living. And that we were to do 3 things. We were to have a pledge form. We were to have an electronic database where you and I, business people, Christians in general, that we would voluntarily become part of this network. So if you wanted to have an electrician or a plumber to come and work in your home, instead of going onto the local yellow pages, wouldn't you rather, if you have 6 or 7 or 10 companies in your city that have committed to be unashamedly ethical, get one of them or 3 of them to give you a quote? The chances are they're going to do a decent job. The chances are they won't steal while you're away at work. And the chances are if there's a latent defect or a problem later, they'll come and sort it out. If you wanted to go and start up a new business in another country, in another province, in another city, wouldn't you rather look at linking up with somebody that you know that stood for those values? And the third leg of this is that there would be an ombudsman. In our case in South Africa, we've got a judge, somebody that's an acting judge, dedicated Christian man, and he effectively is monitoring and coordinating. Typical example, just a few weeks ago, I got a call from one of my friends who's got one of the biggest bus companies in the country. These intercontinental hauliers, luxury buses, and he said to me, "I've got this problem. Another guy who's also a Christian owns the biggest Mercedes dealership in the city," and he said, "Tomorrow I'm actually serving papers on this friend because I bought this vehicle. I've had it in and out a dozen times, and the thing keeps breaking. And when I said to him I don't want it anymore, he wouldn't give me my money back. And so this thing's going the legal route." Both of them have got their companies registered with Unashamedly Ethical. So I said to him, "Have you thought of going to the ombudsman?" He said, "No, I hadn't." So the next day he did that. Within 10 days, the ombudsman had listened to both of them, got their input, had made a ruling, both of them accepted it, problem resolved, and they able to carry on with life. That's just one of many examples. So I want to say to you that it's been amazing to see how this thing has rolled out. I'm going to take you through in my last 10 minutes a few slides that I've got here, and I've probably gone a little bit deeper on some of the background than I maybe intended, but I guess that's the way God has led one on this. So I'd like to just show you a few of the slides that I would like to ask you the question of, what is the dream that you and I have? That you and I have for our city, for our nation, for our country. And corruption at the moment. I remember the first time I chatted with some friends in the US, and at that time they said to me, actually we don't have much of a problem. We realize that Africa is very corrupt, and some South America, and etc. And lo and behold, we know what has happened over the last 2-3 years as some of these things have been exposed. And a very special saying, if you and I always do what we always did, we'll always get what we always got. And I just think about our tradition back home as you go on a New Year's Eve or an Old Year's Eve function. And on your way there, on your way back, my wife would say, "Okay, so what's your New Year's resolution? So is it to lose weight, or is it to get fit, or something like that?" But if I've made myself a certain commitment, I'd better set my alarm an hour earlier and get out on the road, either on my bicycle or to the gym or whatever, because if I keep doing what I've always done, then nothing much is going to change. My kids gave me a little plaque many years back which says you have to work like a slave to live like a king. And, you know, we have a tremendous story in our country about Mark Shuttleworth, a guy who sold his IT business for a few billion. He was one of the few people that flew to the moon in one of these space shuttles, etc. And I highly respect when somebody has that kind of amazing talent or break in life. But for most of us, and certainly for me, it's the long haul. And whatever we are going to achieve is going to be through hard work and dedication. And I think we've heard some amazing speakers here today. Deuteronomy 8 verse 17 and 18 is probably one of my 3 favorite scriptures. You may say to yourself, my power and the strength of my hands have produced this wealth. But remember the Lord your God, for it's He who gives you the ability to produce this wealth. And when I think about how many friends, how many people that have come to me in this economic time where they've either lost their business or they've lost their wife or they've had a divorce or they have lost their health, and then people all of a sudden are on their knees. And I say, thank God that I did not need to lose something nearest and dearest before I came to accept Him and invite Him into my life. And it's sad to know how many people walk around and in fact are on their deathbed at the age of 80 or whatever and still have that void. And I believe that that void, you and I, each one of us are born with that void. And I can chase success and I can chase material things, but until I've invited Christ into my life, I did not have that inner peace. That special, Afrikaans we call it rustigheid. It's a kind of a inner peace which you cannot explain. And I believe that that scripture is so important that whenever I have the privilege of speaking to businessmen and women, I would ask the question, have you and I remembered that the talents that you and I have got, the health we've got, can be taken away from us like that? Let's not wait. Walk out here, find out we either have a heart attack or cancer or be flattened by a bus. But that we realize that unless we have Christ in our life, we will never have that inner peace. The other thing is to see how many people would chase success as I was doing. And I want to say to you, there was a time in my young business career where it was close that I could have very easily have got divorced from my wife, where we went through one of those ripples which I believe every couple go through probably 2 or 3 times. And that we just be reminded that no amount of success can compensate for failure in the family. And to hear how many people say, well, I've built this huge empire, but sadly I've lost my family or my spouse. And I think the question is, do you and I want to be a person of means or a person of meaning? I don't believe that you and I will be remembered by how big our bank balance was the day we died, but that we will be remembered by what we've left behind in our community, in our society, in our area in which we operate. Now, just after I'd made that commitment in 99, and it became public, somebody brought me a little book, and it was called Ethics in the Workplace. And on the front cover it says, you do not need to cheat to win. Middle of the book, there was this ethics checklist. Now, especially in business, I was one of those that were often talking about the grey area, especially when it comes to paying tax. And I would always say, well, that's a grey area, so you can swing with the punches. Now, the first 2 of these points to me is quite straightforward. But the third one removes any grayness out of any decision that I make every day. First one says, is it legal? Yes or no? Second one, is this negotiation, is it balanced? Is it a win-win? The third one clears up any question that I may have about whether I should or shouldn't do something. How will it make me feel if my wife and my kids knew about this deal? And how would it make me feel if it were published in the front page of the newspaper? Now, people would say to me, okay, so at Newlands, the stadium, you've got a suite there, so you're inviting clients there. Is that okay? Is it a bribe or isn't it? Well, I said, well, anybody with a pair of binoculars can see who's there. As long as the person I've invited is not embarrassed to be there and that it won't be something that they would have to please explain. If they're comfortable and I'm comfortable, great. Then they would say, well, okay, how about taking them out to your game farm and their family? Is that okay? I said, again, very clear, as long as they declare it and it's not an embarrassment for them and me. And they say, well, what about taking them to Disney, plus their wife, plus their kids for 2 weeks? So well, it's obviously a bribe. But I think that question number 3 is, whatever I do each day, it must be such that I am at comfort that if my family knows about it and if the press were to get hold of it, it would not be an embarrassment for that person or for myself. That Proverbs 11:1. But this next one is probably the one that makes me smile the most, where it says, food gained by fraud tastes sweet to a man, but he ends up with a mouthful of gravel. Really makes me smile, but I think that sums it up. We may be making a quick buck today, and we may win this amazing project or tender, but boy, 10 years down the line, the truth will come out. This thing that I carry on my arm, 2 Chronicles 7:14, which says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven, forgive their sin and heal their land. I believe that's a promise that God is giving you and I. If we will, number 1, humble ourselves and pray. Number 2, that we will turn from our wicked ways. I believe that He will hear from heaven, forgive our sin and heal our land. That's a promise that I believe God is giving you and I. And I believe we will not eradicate systemic poverty around the world, Africa, India, South America, wherever, unless we eradicate systemic corruption. So the question, I think, for you and I is, what is God's plan for your life, for my life, and what are we going to do about it? And I think you and I need to choose. Are we prepared to be unashamedly ethical, or are we going to stick with what we know is happening in the world right now?